Hi.
Welcome to our first podcast. We've been looking forward to doing this for a while.
A very long time.
So I am Valorie Chadwick. I have been a writing coach since 2017. We're local here in Las Vegas. And basically my job as a writing coach is to find writers who they want to do something with their stories, whether they want to get published or they just want to really develop a hobby to get them kind of out of their daily lives. Depending on, doesn't matter where they are in the process, my job is to meet them there and to hold their hand through that process to get them to their goals and to teach them. So I've been looking forward to doing a podcast for a while, and now we're doing it.
Yes, we are.
So you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I am also Valorie Chadwick. Wait, no, that's not right. I'm Isaiah Chadwick. I'm fortunately married to the podcast host. So I am not a writing coach. However, I am a writer. I'm working on a novel right now.
Yes.
I have always been enamored by stories, storytelling. If you talk to most anybody who knew me when I was younger, I usually wasn't there. I was somewhere else.
You still are, babe.
Yes. You're lucky I'm even here.
Yeah.
And so I have, in one way or another, kind of dedicated pretty strong portions of my life to storytelling and the art of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout that process, I've come to pick up a few things here and there, and I have the great fortune of being married to a writing coach, and so we just get to rant and ramble.
We rant and ramble so much.
On story structure, character development, and a lot of stuff that I think we're going to be actually talking and sharing with you guys. So I'm really excited to be a part of this.
Yeah, and even though Isaiah's not, in it professionally like I am, he's definitely a nerd and definitely knows what he's talking about.
That
so
is
I
true.
can definitely vouch for him. And I'm really excited to finally take these conversations that we have and actually share them with the world.
Yeah, and hopefully help people be able to take their own writing and learn from the hard lessons we've learned.
Right.
And the fun lessons we've learned. Like, we've had a lot of fun talking about these things.
Yes, it's been a lot of fun. And not only fun talking about it, but looking at things, not just books, but movies and television shows and plays and scripts and analyzing them and seeing what people do well and what they do not so well and how we can take those things and apply them to ourselves and learn from them. And
even bad examples of writing can give us very, very fruitful sources of constructive criticism, or just I don't want to go down that path. I just don't want to do what that guy did.
Yeah, exactly. So for our first podcast topic, it's a topic that's near and dear to our hearts because once you see it, you kind of can't unsee it. And so we have definitely analyzed the heck out of this topic.
Yes. Yes, this is a topic that we started having when we were before we were dating, I think.
Yeah, we've been talking about it for a while.
And it's one of those things that after we learned how it works, it definitely made a big impact on watching, seeing it in action.
Mm-hmm.
And so, with no further ado,
so we're going to be talking about masculine versus feminine storytelling, sometimes called masculine versus feminine fantasy, which kind of sounds funny. Sounds a little
like not necessarily a family-friendly podcast.
Gonna be talking about feminine fantasy. No, yeah, it's fantasy as in
what is it that you imagine?
Yeah, the fantastical. It is a funny name, and we acknowledge that, and we try to use the word storytelling instead of fantasy. But throughout this podcast, fantasy, storytelling, those words are interchangeable. We try to use the word storytelling, but it's old habit, so we'll say fantasy. Habit. So, what is masculine and feminine fantasy? Because this is not a super familiar term. I'm really surprised that this topic isn't covered by more writers.
Once you kind of see the nuts and the bolts of it, like you said, you can't unsee it, and it makes sort of categorizing a story make more sense.
Yeah,
and it makes like following the story a lot more sense. To clarify, this is when we say masculine and feminine storytelling, we're not talking about gender identity. What we're talking about is more of broad strokes. Where does this story and the story beats kind of follow?
Yeah. So that's like the caveat right off the bat. When we're talking about masculine versus feminine, it has nothing to do with the gender of the person who wrote it. It has nothing to do with the gender of, the main character or whoever's starring in it. It has nothing to do with the gender of the audience. We're not talking about stories that boys like and stories that girls like. I am a woman and happily married to a man, and I'm a total girly girl. I get my nails done and I'm wearing pink ears. But I write primarily in masculine formatted storytelling. Mm-hmm. So think of it more of like how other languages have like masculine and feminine like wording. Mm-hmm. At the ends of their,
like in Spanish it's an O.
Oh, and an A. Yeah. Like, so that's not saying like, oh, you're a boy, you can't say a word that ends in an A. Like, that has nothing to do with it. It's just a masculine or feminine, so to speak, word. And so it's kind of the same thing here. We're not talking about people per se. We're talking about the structure of a story.
Yeah, and when we're approaching storytelling in this way, like, this might sound abstract, especially if none of you have ever heard of this concept. I think when I introduced you to it, I was the first person, and you went to college too, right?
Yeah.
And nobody thought about mentioning this.
Yeah. It's definitely not a very well-known subject, which blows my mind. But.
So there is a self-evidence of this being kind of true, and while this storytelling doesn't require feminine or masculine audience, it does kind of reach those demographics a lot more well. And demographics is very important when it comes to writing.
Whenever I have a client, and I ask them, what is your target audience? And they say, I want this book to be enjoyed by everybody. Like, that's a red flag right there. Like, you need a target audience. Like, what is this? Is it a YA novel? Is it an X-rated horror? Like, we gotta know, because if you're not aiming for anyone, if you're not aiming for anything, you're not gonna hit anything. Target audiences are definitely important. They're kind of non-negotiable if you want to be successful with your work.
You're not gonna go to, let's say, a bookstore and say, give me a book.
Right.
You're not gonna go.
Oh, we might.
Yeah, but we don't count. You're not gonna go to the movies and say, "Give me a ticket."
Right.
You're gonna go looking for something that is of interest to you, which
it's been curated to someone like you,
and which is generally like genres. Mm-hmm. So a good way to look at it is almost like, this is a genre of storytelling that other genres fit into.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, babe, is masculine and feminine storytelling are like the two broadest category of genre, really.
Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it. Masculine and feminine fantasy, even though that's not part of the definition, that is what they tend toward. Feminine fantasy does tend to target a more feminine audience. Masculine fantasy does tend to target a more masculine audience.
So what is the deal with with masculine and feminine storytelling? Like, why do we feel this whole video is necessary?
So there are a couple different components to defining whether something is masculine or feminine in terms of storytelling. Things that you want to be looking at is, what is the status quo? How does the story start off? What is that situation like? What is the thing that drives the story? Like, what starts it? What is the conflict? And another important thing you want to be looking at is the characters. Like, who are the characters? What are their roles in society? What is their character arc over the course of the story? How do they play a part in the conflict's resolution, the ending of the story?
All right, so talking about story structure and all of how to tell a story with masculine and feminine fantasy, the status quo, all of those components that go into like this whole storytelling structure, like what are the things we need to know about that? What are the differences between these two structures?
A big component is a level of stability. So in masculine fantasy, you always see a certain level of stability at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in the status quo, your main character is going to be kind of... I wouldn't say he's necessarily safe at the beginning. He might be in danger because he's in action and stuff, but there's like a kind of consistency to his life. And as the story goes on, he loses stability and somehow has to gain it back. For feminine fantasy, there is a lack of stability at the beginning.
Okay.
Right? And that is going to be her goal kind of throughout the story. And she's always going to be aiming for some kind of more stability.
Right. So, like, what is the thing that's going to make this fluctuating life, this risky life, something that's more tenable, something she can actually deal with?
Mm-hmm.
Also, keeping in mind with like the beginning of the story with stability, this is not including the prologue. The prologue doesn't count for this. We're just talking about the hero's story. Because the prologue is more of like setting the scene that the hero has their story take place in.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Kind of like, here's a good example of it. Indiana Jones, right? The very first movie. And I'm just going to say this right now. I will, throughout these podcasts, assuming that we make more of them, I will use movies as examples way more often than I will use books as examples. I mean, I'm a writing coach. I work with books. I love books. I also acknowledge books take a lot longer to read than movies take to watch. And there is, for the sake of you guys watching the podcast, there is a far greater chance that you're going to recognize when I reference a movie than when I reference a book. So I'm going to use movies for the most part, just because the likelihood of you knowing what I'm talking about is a lot greater.
And if you don't know what we're talking about, like, it's 90 minutes, guys. It's not that big of a deal.
Is this 90 minutes?
Maybe 2.5 hours.
2.5?
No,
I was thinking 4.
I'm talking about movies in general.
You meant the podcast.
No,
it might be a 4-hour podcast.
It might be a 4-hour podcast.
I got it. Yes.
But if we talk about a movie you've never seen,
it's only 90 minutes of you not knowing what we're talking about.
Unless it's like a bad movie, in which case I will give a disclaimer. This is not a movie you need to go see. If you've never seen Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, you need to stop this video.
Yeah.
Go find Raiders of the Lost Ark. It is found everywhere in all the places. I think you could actually say this and hold me to legal ramifications.
Oh, babe.
That Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark is available anywhere. Go to your refrigerator. It's in there.
And so when you see it, you'll know what I'm talking about at the beginning of the movie, right? It starts off with Indy in, he's in some jungle and he's like going to get like the little golden idol and the arrows are shooting at him and like the rocks rolling after him, and that does not look like a stable situation.
No, it doesn't.
But that's just prologue.
That is
right. That's just the hook. The actual beginning of Indiana Jones's story starts out, and he's where?
He's at the school.
He's at the school.
He's at the university.
Right.
Teaching archaeology.
Like that's
telling people you're going to be reading books for most of your career.
Yes. So that's super stable. And then things happen and he loses his stability, right?
Same thing happens in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. Yes, I said the entire title. You're welcome. The beginning of the story is this massive laser battle between starships, and there's this whole empire. What is this? There's Princess Leia, who is apparently important. She has these droids with these secret military plans. All these really big, huge consequences.
Yeah.
But it's prologue.
It's just prologue.
The story doesn't really begin until you get to the hero, which is Luke.
Yeah, and he's just on his dirt farm.
He's just on his moisture farm. Farming those moisture cows.
Yes. So masculine fantasy, even if it doesn't look like it starts in stability, the core of the story starts in stability. Right? And
for the hero.
For the hero. But like that's where the story really lies, is in the character. And I will say that over and over and over again, is that story is in the character.
Yeah, if you're writing a story and you don't know who your main character is, that's going to be a big thing. And maybe this video will actually help to kind of inform you of how you want your character, especially your main character, your protagonist, how they're going to behave. And we're going to be talking about protagonists, especially later in this podcast.
Right. Yeah. And so in terms of stability, and in terms of main characters, for the feminine fantasy, she's the opposite. She is ever striving towards that stability. In fact, to the point where sometimes stability is the whole point of the story. Like, that is her whole goal. That's the thing driving the plot, is her search for stability. And ultimately, it's how the movie's going to end.
Right. So it's like, this especially happens in a lot of like those dramas.
Mm-hmm. They end in marriage.
They end in marriage. Like,
yeah, some kind of resolution.
So this might be a little bit of a niche. I'm sorry. This might be a little bit of a niche movie, but Ever After is a good example, which is just Cinderella. So I'll just use Cinderella.
Okay, there you go.
So in Cinderella's life is very unstable because she is just at the beck and call of her mother and her stepsisters. Now, while that is a status quo, it's not stability. Her life is not comfortable. Whereas in masculine fantasy, usually their life, it's constraining them. And feminine fantasy, it's a little bit different because Cinderella's still being constrained, but she's being constrained in not being able to relax. Whereas masculine characters are usually being constrained in that they're not allowed to go and do.
Yeah. And how are the characters viewing the world? Masculine fantasy, it's stable, right? But there's a huge focus on conflict. So how does the main character view the world?
Well, the main character is going to see, like, there's a problem I need to solve. Mm-hmm. My life is too stable to go solve it. So, the main character probably views, like, there's problems out there. Mm-hmm. Luke Skywalker says the Empire is bad. Luke Skywalker's not directly affected by the Empire, but he's like, it sucks out there.
So there's stability. Yes, but there's also like a pretty raw and honest admission of, to some degree, this sucks, right? Yeah, and that's kind of how the character viewed the world.
There's a problem out there.
There's a problem out there, which probably contributes to the character going out of his way and like chasing after change, right?
Yeah, a lot of times in masculine fantasy, the main character could just bow out, like in the beginning of the story. Mm-hmm. Not later, when he's really invested and there's consequences.
Yeah. But
really early in the story, it'd be really easy for the main character to go, yeah, I'm just going to let somebody else handle this.
Yeah. But he doesn't, because he's got to be the best.
He's got to be the best.
Feminine fantasy. However,
Mm-hmm.
we're looking for stability.
We're looking
right?
So I'm going to focus on whatever stability I have, or whatever stability I can claim.
Yes, and this is so common, I think. This isn't one of the first things that, we've talked about and we've noticed, but like since we have brought it up, it has been something that I've noticed more, is that it's really common in feminine fantasy for there to be like this presentation of everything's fine.
Or at least everything's boring.
Yeah. Everything is stable. But there's really this aspect that makes it unstable. Mm-hmm. Like, in reality, it's not stable, and I crave that stability. But let me show you how normal life is, mm-hmm. right? And that is how the character initially presents the world, right?
Yeah, this is the world's vision from the main character.
Right.
Not the plot, because the way a character views the world and the way the world actually is can be very different. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a really good technique if you can make the way the character views the world different than how the world actually is. Mm-hmm. Because now the viewer is experiencing the world from that character's perspective.
Yeah. But it ties into the plot so perfectly because, again, what drives the plot? Character. So how the character is viewing the world, masculine character, yeah, he's stable, but he sees a problem. He's going to go change. Feminine character, she
wants to cling on to whatever stability she has.
Right. But she sees the instability in it. She sees that little flaw as much as she wants to ignore it. And so she's going to seek that.
She's going to seek
that resolution. Yeah, that's really good. There's in masculine fantasy they're trapped in the sense that they don't have freedom. So feminine fantasy, yeah. In feminine fantasy, they're trapped in the sense that to some degree they're oppressed. Right. So that is one of the first things to look for when you're trying to figure out if something is masculine or feminine fantasy storytelling. Or if you're even trying to figure out like what kind of style do I write in, that's one of the first things to look at. Where is the stability in the story? Is it something at the beginning that gets lost? Or is it something at the end that you've been striving towards?
Striving for those ends in order to get through the story, you're going to have to take your character through conflict.
Yeah.
And that's where we see like the stability, either the lack of it or the presence of it being challenged, is through how your characters are going to overcome and face conflict throughout the story. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do your characters handle conflict? Are they an overarching conflict where everything the characters are doing is building towards this single goal that mm-hmm. they've had? Or are there a lot of smaller, more episodic conflicts mm-hmm. that are very short-lived and are very quickly sort of resolved? So mm-hmm. a masculine fantasy, the characters might be struggling with this overarching conflict throughout the entirety of the story. Mm-hmm. Whereas in feminine fantasy, they might not even realize what their big overarching conflict has been until the last 10 minutes of the story.
Yeah.
And it just is a different way to kind of parse out the pacing of your story. Mm-hmm. Do you want everybody to focus on this big thing over time, or do you want to sort of stop along the way and be able to sort of treat this individual experience that your character goes through as something that is just as important as the big arc?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And the reason for this, the reason why masculine fantasy tends to be one big long story with lots of, small conflicts in it, but yeah. Overall one overarching story, whereas feminine fantasy tends to be more kind of episodic. One little conflict and then it's resolved. One little conflict and then it's resolved. One little conflict and then it's resolved. And the reason for this is, and this is probably, I would say, is probably the biggest distinction between masculine fantasy versus feminine fantasy, is that masculine fantasy is focused on conflict. Feminine fantasy is focused on resolution.
All right, so with that being so important to the idea of this topic, like, what does that mean? Why is masculine fantasy so focused on conflict, whereas feminine is so focused on resolution?
Right, so because masculine fantasy tends to start out in a place of stability, the story is driven by that stability unwinding, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a constantly growing sense of conflict, and a constantly growing battle, in a sense. For feminine fantasy, they're already a mess to some degree, right? And they want stability. So they're not trying to ruffle any more feathers than are already ruffled. They're trying to resolve. They're trying to, build and layer and bring together relationships between characters. So a feminine fantasy storyline looks a lot more like, let's solve all these little problems to get to the overall stability. Mm-hmm. Whereas masculine fantasy is
let's go break things.
Things are messed up. Let's go fight and save the world.
We have to punch somebody in the face. That will solve all of our problems.
All of the problems. Yeah. So that is probably the biggest distinction is masculine fantasy starts with stability and is focused on conflict. Feminine fantasy, it needs stability, and so it's therefore focused on resolution.
And you see this all the time in, for example, superhero movies. Superhero movies, what is it the audience is always waiting for? It's for the big fight.
The big fight at the very end. Yeah. It's the war. Yeah.
You have to wait through the entire movie to get there.
Yeah.
But that's the emotional payoff, is watching the hero overcome the biggest problem of the story.
Right.
Whereas in feminine fantasy, it's all about how did resolving these smaller conflicts, these little issues, result in everything finally coming together and fixing it.
And now we have the stability.
And now everything is stable.
Yeah, exactly. So another thing to point out about the conflict is that a lot of times in masculine fantasy, the conflict is exterior. It's outside of the characters.
It's outside of the main character's control.
Right, it's outside of the main character's control, exactly. And so the main character has to go fix a problem that is outside of himself. He has to go fight a bad guy. He has to go save the world, and all of the problems... He has to
go out and get the girl.
Yeah, all of the problems are outside of him. In feminine fantasy, all of the problems are relational. They're between her and the other characters, and which kind of lends into how it's so episodic in its resolution, is if every problem in the story is between me and you, then as soon as me and you get solved, then I can move on to the next character who I have an issue with and grow my stability that way. So it's a lot more relational and interpersonal rather than, as you say, let's go break things.
But with the focus being on that relationship with the feminine fantasy, mm-hmm. it's going to drive the characters to try and fix the problems that sort of come to them. Mm-hmm. And so in masculine fantasy, yes, the problems come to the hero, and the hero has to figure out how to resolve them. But the heroes will also go out and search for problems. Yeah. And with, again, the idea of feminine fantasy, stability is the goal. Uh-huh. A lot of those forces that are creating the instability in her life are going to be things that are affecting her directly. It's almost as if the problems are coming into her life, mm-hmm. rather than she's going out to seek out the problems.
Yeah.
So anytime you have characters that are going out to solve the problems that are out in the world, mm-hmm. or anytime you have a character trying to like overcome the problems that are invading their life, whether those conflicts are external that they go and seek out or internal that they have to now try and find a way to resolve. The question then becomes, who is solving these problems? Mm-hmm. So what is it that your protagonist is doing? And protagonists in masculine fantasy completely operate differently than in feminine fantasy.
Yes. So in masculine fantasy, your protagonist 9 times out of 10 is going to be the best at what he does. He's going to be the top of his game. He's going to be like all powerful. Number one, he's going out. He's the one they call to solve these problems.
And if he's not the best, then he's a close runner-up. He is a contender, and he is in this position because people respect him to be capable of doing this job.
Right.
The main character is capable.
Right. And a lot of times when you go to, kind of the extreme cases of masculine fantasy, he's the one, getting all the girls. He's winning all the bets. He's, the fast shooter. He's the best swordsman. He's I am famous.
So good at math!
He's the best at what he does, which is why he's going and solving these, exterior conflicts, and it takes him, the whole story to do it.
Which, in all fairness, nerding out for a second, that really harkens back to the original concept of the hero. In ancient Greek lore, which is where a lot of like the hero archetypes sort of started out. Heroes were almost inhuman. Like they were demigods most of the time, or you were descended from a king. You, generally speaking, you were a person. You were a kind of person that an average person couldn't possibly live up to.
Right.
And so we see this all the time with like masculine fantasy. We really are seeing it a lot in the superhero genre.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, for sure. The superhero genre is super masculine fantasy. It's just, exactly, it's your modern day Hercules. It's your modern day Odysseus. Like, these guys are the best at their game, and so that's why there's a story, Beowulf, right? Beowulf is a great example. He's the best at his game, and there's this lore built around him of the battles that he fights and the victories that he wins. And that is not the case in feminine fantasy.
No, it's not.
Feminine fantasy is opposite. Your girl's going to be average. She's going to be misunderstood. She's going to be underappreciated.
The only version that is all true. There is a secondary version where she is actually this big important thing, but she has been inhibited. Yeah. Sleeping Beauty, for example, Cinderella. These are girls that are highly capable, but they're oppressed by their circumstances.
Yeah, that ties into them being misunderstood, though. Even if, it's to some degree they have this potential and they have this ability. Whether they're average or great, they have this potential and this ability, but they're misunderstood and not appreciated for what they have. So before we get too deep into, like, characters and pulling apart the nitty-gritty, which we're already starting to do.
Oh, we're having too much fun with the nitty-gritty.
Let's look at just some popular media examples. Yeah, so masculine fantasy.
James Bond for sure.
Absolutely.
Like Bond. James Bond. As if that's different from all the other Bonds that are possibly in your life or at this event. Like, he's suave, he's cool, he's got the gadgets. He's the guy when they're like, hey, Agent 007, the world is in crisis, we need the best, we're sending
you. And while you're on your mission, you're going to sleep with way too many girls. You're going to drink way too many drinks, and you're still going to be, like, completely focused and, able to do all these crazy stunts. Like, he's at the top of his game.
He is, if you were to take the ideal masculine fantasy, he really fulfills it well, but he's not the exclusive example. I mean, what else we got? Indiana Jones.
Yeah, I was talking about Indiana Jones earlier, and same thing. He's like the infamous Professor Adventurer. You know, not only is he smart, not only is he like, was he teach at like Oxford or something?
Yeah, it's Oxford.
Yeah, like some super like high
Ivy
school.
League.
Yeah, like he's super smart, but also like on the side he goes on all these adventures and like, you know, just finds the Holy Grail just casually, like on a Tuesday, you know, like the Ark of the Covenant, like and, just all in a day's work, right?
And his girl students, they write like "I love you" on their eyelids.
That's actually a really good point. Is a lot of times in masculine fantasy, the protagonist is desired.
Yes,
right.
Desired both from like romantic interests, but also like desired by like by the other characters. Like this is a person that the character wants to be their friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And they're just attractive on all levels. Mm-hmm. You know, they are the Greek hero. They're the Greek hero. They're what we all aspire to be. If we were the coolest kids on the block, we would be this person.
Yeah.
Right. So what about Pirates of the Caribbean? How would you analyze that as masculine fantasy?
Well, it already has some of the hallmarks we talked about mm-hmm. like it's the stable situation becoming unstable, but then like take a look at every single character. Let's avoid maybe the entire franchise, but let's just look at the main characters in the first movie. You've got
Curse of the Black Pearl movie?
Yeah, Curse of the Black Pearl. You know, before they made 1.5 million movies. So you've got Captain Jack Sparrow, mm-hmm. who is the best pirate I've ever seen, after being called the worst pirate I've ever seen.
Yeah.
So he's skilled, he's conniving, he's plotting, and he is driven. Oh, is Captain Jack ever so driven.
And you know what? He's super drunk.
He's super drunk the entire time. And he's
still pulling all of this off.
Yeah, and then you have Will Turner, who mm-hmm. not only does he look like he's a good-looking guy, but mm-hmm. he also is an incredible blacksmith mm-hmm. and an incredible swordsman. Mm-hmm. Like, he has no business. He has no practical need to be a good swordsman, but he trains every day.
Yeah. He's out to get the girl.
And
you know what? Even though he seems kind of like an average Joe on the surface, like, the further you get into the story, you know that he's got, like, this bloodline, and he's
the
part
promised one.
Yeah, he's the promised one. He's part of this legend, right? So even though he kind of looks pretty plain Jane from, mm-hmm.
you
know, the get-go, like, really he's, you know, he's kind of the mm-hmm. larger-than-life character.
Yeah.
And really, like, Will Turner is the main character.
Yeah, Will Turner is an argument could be made that it's also Elizabeth Swann, because her decisions are the decisions that kind of kick off the plot.
That's true.
But, like, let's be real, she's kind of captured for a substantial portion of the movie.
Mm-hmm. But even if we were to put Will aside and even just look at Elizabeth, right? And we're getting super off topic here, but I'm going to say this one thing about Pirates of the Caribbean and then we're going to move on. Even if you look at Elizabeth and say, okay, let's say she is the main character, like, even though she's, like, super feminine woman, yes. but she's still a masculine fantasy character because she starts off in stability, she sees this, you know, external conflict and goes out, I'm going to go fix it, and also I'm, like, the governor.
I'm the governor's daughter.
Is he the governor?
Yeah.
Whoever he is. She's his
You're
daughter.
The governor's daughter.
Hello, puppet. Yeah, and so she's kind of like in this larger than life position, so and she's out to fix it.
Even though she is the romantic interest, and an argument could be made as to how much of the protagonist she is, mm-hmm. she is still taking very masculine fantasy steps
Yeah.
to progress the story.
Yeah. So, for now, kind of reining it back in, what are some examples that you can think of feminine fantasy, just like right off the bat?
Every Hallmark movie ever made.
Yes. That's a fact. Like every single Hallmark movie, you've got your girl, she's like a school teacher, she works in a bookstore, and she's just underappreciated and misunderstood.
Or
and
it's
just,
one of the ones that actually does star a guy, but he also is kind of underappreciated and misunderstood, and people don't really understand the depths of his character.
Yes.
And we're not trying to sound condescending at all. It's just, if you watch a Hallmark movie, congratulations, you have now seen every
Hallmark movie. Yeah.
But you know what the best part of a Hallmark movie is? It makes you feel good.
Yeah.
And that is ultimately what happens the most frequently in feminine fantasy, is there's this idea of like, this character starts in instability. Mm-hmm. Then, as this character is recognized, as this character develops relationships with other characters, and there's healing in those relationships, the characters finally are able to connect, and there's this wholesomeness to feminine fantasy, especially in like, you see it all the time in Hallmark movies, where in the start of the movie, I hate my sister's guts. Me and my sister will never get along. Mom gets cancer. Sisters have to come together. And then mom is getting treatment. And then the sisters realize that, they've been bickering over stupid stuff. And then they start to realize they have stuff in common. Then mom's going to die. So the sister who's estranged gives up a kidney or something. And then the entire family...
Is this a movie, or are you making this up on the spot?
I'm making this up on the spot. Although, I would not be surprised if this is a Hallmark movie.
Oh, gosh. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There is the whole Hallmark franchise. Is it a franchise?
The Hallmark of the Hallmark Channel.
The hallmark of the Hallmark Channel is feminine fantasy structure to a T. Like, absolutely.
And if you don't believe me, if you don't believe us, ask yourself, who's Hallmark's target demographic? Because it's not us.
It's my grandma.
It's your grandma. It's my mom's age bracket, more mature women, women with families.
Which, like, a story about resolution and stability is exactly the kind of story that demographic's going to be interested in.
Yeah, I mean, you have enough instability at home, in like life with your own relationship. So having stability in the story where those wounds are healed, where that conflict is resolved, where everything, when you get to the end of it, is made better. Like,
feminine fantasy is healing fantasy.
Feminine fantasy is healing fantasy, especially between individuals.
Yeah. It's a very nurturing kind of storytelling, isn't it? I think another good example of, kind of a hallmark of feminine fantasy, besides just Hallmark, is early Disney princess movies. Maybe not so much the modern ones, because there is, kind of a feminist kick going on, and there's like a lot of like
girl power.
Yeah, girl power, like go-getter kind of girls. And sometimes those movies tend to like lean more towards masculine fantasy, actually. But like early Disney princess films.
Yeah, like Snow White, for example.
Snow White, you said earlier Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, like these just kind of unrealized potential.
In all those instances, they are the princess material, or sometimes actual princesses. But what are they doing? They are acting as servants, they're acting as commoners, they're acting as peasants, and they're forced into these roles. And it's only as the story progresses that they, and also the other characters, realize who they actually are.
Oh, and another good one. The one with the monster, and she's in the library. She's got a yellow dress.
The monster, yellow dress, library.
Disney princess. Come on, she's French. Bonjour.
Oh, Belle. Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, perfect example.
How do you not remember the Beauty and the Beast?
This is a perfect example of feminine fantasy. I mean, like, she's... Forgive
Little
me,
town,
it's been...
it's a sleepy village. And then she's just talking about how slow everything is and how repetitive, and everybody else is like, look at that weirdo.
Yeah, like, she's like the nerd of the town, right? And yet she goes to the tower, gets locked up with the wolf bear.
Beast.
Yeah, the beast.
You can just call his character's name is the Beast.
I haven't seen this since I was like 6, okay? Like, so she gets locked up, and then like the whole story is her resolving the relationship with the beast, right?
Yeah, the whole story is her. The whole conflict comes down to Belle healing the beast. Like, that is that's every character's motivation. And it's not until the beast learns to value and learns to appraise Belle at this high level that Belle reciprocates, and their relationship becomes whole. And it's through that relationship becoming whole that the conflict is finally resolved, and the beast is made into the prince.
So another, and this is more of a genre than it is like a specific film or film company, but sitcoms. Sitcoms are very frequently feminine fantasy. Typically, sitcoms take place in very like average, everyday.
It takes place in a home.
It takes place in a home, yeah, or in just a place of work, or it's between friends. But I think aside from just like the average kind of mundanity of the setting that it usually takes place in, sitcoms, they're very episodic. It's just like some little tiny relationship kind of conflict, and oh no, let's resolve this so we can get to stability, and then the episode ends.
Yeah.
New episode, new conflict. Like, it's just a little tiny bite-sized feminine fantasy in a nutshell.
Yeah. And I loved sitcoms growing up. Like, sitcoms are funny and great and enjoyable. But you're right. Like, the general expectation at the end of the sitcom is everything is going to be back to normal.
Right. Because otherwise it's not comedy. Then you start going into tragedy territory. Yeah. Like, there's this... It's so feel good because you know that it's not going to be... Yeah. There's not going to be crazy consequences.
And, further evidence that you're dealing with feminine fantasy versus masculine fantasy is, again, where's the focus? Is the focus on the resolution, or is the focus on the conflict? Mm-hmm. And anytime you watch, like, a sitcom, Full House, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, some third option...
That wasn't from your early childhood.
Exactly. How long is the story built around the characters overcoming like this great oppressive conflict? And how much of the time of the episode is them leading up to it, and then them being out of it?
Yeah. Because
in masculine fantasy, the whole point is to overcome the conflict.
Yeah. It's the conflict is the whole story in masculine fantasy. In feminine fantasy, it's the conflict in and of itself is a very short bit. It's almost...
It might even happen off screen.
Yeah, it's almost just there just to facilitate resolution happening.
Yeah.
And it's going to be fun the whole way there. It's going to be funny.
Yeah,
it's going to be
great.
The conflict was a misunderstanding and it's awkward and embarrassing
or the conflict was our relationship hasn't properly been like either defined or recognized or appreciated. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to take this moment to now not only define our relationship, I'm going to take time to appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So now that we've looked at some examples, let's move on to talking about the other kind of aspects that you might be able to pinpoint in a masculine or feminine story, and what is the driving force of story other than character. So we already talked about how the protagonist or the main character in masculine fantasy is going to be like the best top of his class, And then the protagonist, main character in feminine fantasy, is going to be kind of underappreciated, misunderstood, always a bridesmaid, never a bride, kind of a thing. Yes, exactly. And we've all already kind of talked about their goal, in a sense, just in terms of the structure.
And masculine fantasy has to be bigger than the conflict. It's all about how the hero needs to fix themselves. Like Rocky, he has to work out. Iron Man, he has to figure out how to make the better suit. Like,
right.
How does the character transform to meet the circumstance?
Yeah. I think in terms of like character arc, a big point of masculine fantasy is just exactly that word you use, that transformation process. To I'm the best at what I am, but something happened to stop my stability, and so now I have to make a change so I can trump that, right? So it's this, I have to transform, I have to further evolve, right?
I'm not good enough now, I need to be good enough.
Yeah, advance to the next level, beat the boss, right?
I need to level up.
I need to level up, yeah. Feminine fantasy, it's...
Usually you start out, you're capable.
Yeah.
Like you might fine-tune it.
Yeah.
But you're already
capable. You're underappreciated and misunderstood, but you're capable, typically. So then it's more, your character arc is more about acceptance and self-acceptance.
Right.
And acceptance of your circumstance and acceptance of who you are.
And other people's acceptance of you.
Yes. Other people's acceptance of you. That's a huge one. Like finally getting to that stability of being accepted and being understood.
And recognized for who you are and what you're capable of.
Right. Exactly.
So whether that's the guy that you're trying to spend the entire story trying to get to, but it turns out it wasn't him, it was his brother who's a better guy.
I like how fast you can make up feminine fantasy.
Oh no, that's from Bridget Jones's Diary.
Okay. But yeah, it's definitely masculine fantasy. It's all about transformation, evolution. Feminine fantasy, it's all about acceptance of yourself and letting other people accept you.
Yeah. So because you're never going to meet that stability unless you're accepted. Like, as long as you're not accepted, you're never going to have stability. And that means, like, in feminine fantasy, they're going to have to make, effectively speaking, the bad guy like them.
Yeah. Ooh, that's good.
Like, that has to happen in feminine fantasy.
Yeah, because, you're not going to blow up the bad guy in feminine fantasy. Like, that's creating conflict.
They might be written off.
Yeah.
Like in Cinderella, like, you just never hear from the stepmother ever again.
Bye.
It's just bye. My relationship has now been established with the prince, who does appreciate me.
And in a sense, a cutting off of that relationship is a resolution of it. Like,
right.
That is resolved. That is concluded. Right?
Yeah, because that is a good point, because in feminine fantasy, sometimes resolving a conflict doesn't mean, like, a relationship that was incapable of being repaired was repaired. Because if you have a relationship that is destructive, sometimes the resolution is getting out of that relationship.
Yeah. True in life, too. So what about other characters? What about, say, like the villain or the antagonist?
Ooh.
Start with masculine fantasy.
Okay, well, James Bond has to have the spy he fights against. Indiana Jones has to have the archaeologist that is maybe not as smart, but way more resourceful than he is. So in masculine fantasy, it's almost invariably somebody that has a competing goal with the protagonist.
Yeah.
Like,
it's a competitor.
Yeah, and they're usually like have the upper hand. Like, if the main character, if the hero is the most is the most competent at what he does. He's the best in what he does. If he's not the best, then he's like the promised one who will become the best one day. He just needs to unlock his true potential, whatever. If the villain cannot beat the hero by like matching strength for strength, he will beat the hero by numbers. He'll have greater resources. He'll have a larger pool of wealth. He will have lackeys that their sole job is to show up and just be cannon fodder for the hero.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's a competition, and that
it's a competition that's weighted against the hero.
Yeah.
Like he has huge odds he has to now overcome.
Yeah.
Like it's not a fair fight.
Which is kind of why, like, okay, yeah, you are the best, but this is what is breaking your stability, right? Is now there's a greater degree of competition for whatever reason. There's something new to fight for.
There's something that challenges you.
Yeah, there's something new to achieve, right? So the bad guy, whether it be a villain or an antagonist, yes, there can be a difference, and often is. Yeah, it's competition. The villain or the antagonist in feminine fantasy, however, because the protagonist is right? Underappreciated. I was going to say understood, but that's wrong. She's misunderstood. There's going to be not someone on her level who's competing with her, but there's going to be someone above her. There's going to be a superior.
The stepmother.
There's going to be the stepmother. There's going to be the popular girl. There's going to be the prettier girl who gets the guy. You know, there's going to be someone else who gets the promotion. Or
the boss.
The boss. There's going to be a man who gets the promotion instead of her, right? There's going to be some kind of someone is superior to me. Mm-hmm. And that's the bad guy of the story.
Which makes sense if the whole point of the feminine story model is all about being underappreciated. Mm-hmm. You're going to be underappreciated when you're seen as somebody who is not necessarily like inferior, like you're a lesser human being, but you are like ranked
like lower on the totem pole.
Exactly.
Yeah. So masculine fantasy, competition. Feminine fantasy, it's superiority. Mm-hmm. What about the trajectory of different foes and allies?
Okay.
Like the relationship between people who are on your side versus people who are against you. That dynamic throughout the course of the story. Maybe not initially, or like if you take out individual parts, no. But throughout looking at the story as a whole, those take on different paths.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. You, like for example, just hearkening it back to Pirates of the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Like Jack Sparrow goes from being Will's being Will's enemy to being his ally, to being his enemy, to being his ally.
Yeah. I think that's okay. So masculine fantasy, it's very conflict based.
Very my goal versus your goal.
Yeah, and there's a lot of inherent competition in that, especially with the villain. So in masculine fantasy, you're going to see a lot of allies becoming foes. You're going to see a lot of betrayal. You're going to see a lot of, you were a double agent this whole time.
No, I just lied about being a regular agent.
Feminine fantasy, it's all about reconciliation, right? So you're going to see foes become allies in the end. She was misunderstood by these people, but now they see her for who she truly is, and they were her enemies, but now they're her friends. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's that reconciliation. So masculine fantasy, a lot of times you'll see the allies and those closest to you turn against you. In feminine fantasy, you see those broken relationships then restored. Mm-hmm.
With a little bit of an exception of like the sense of loyalty, like in masculine fantasy, a lot of it is about are you competing against my goal, or do we have same goal? Mm-hmm. And so, like, whether or not you're the main character, again, masculine fantasy is all conflict oriented, which means allies, friends, and enemies are going to be defined by, are you on my side or are you competing against me? Mm-hmm. Whereas in feminine fantasy, because it's more about like the relationships, people don't necessarily have those competing goals. Mm-hmm. Not unless, of course, the competing goal is like an exclusive relationship or a circumstance they're afraid of losing.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, what are the stakes? In masculine fantasy, it's you're risking life and limb.
Yeah, like, it's usually like everything is on the line.
Yeah.
It's a blue energy sky beam time, guys.
People can die.
People did die.
People are dead.
I lost everything in the house fire, flood, earthquake.
Yes. Tornado, hurricane.
Volcano.
And that's how the story begins. Feminine fantasy, does anyone ever die? Ever? Yes. But is it a risk in terms of conflict? Yes. Okay, let me rewind. Yes, people die in feminine fantasy. Yes. But it's usually a point of grief. Or, it's not a cause of conflict. Right. Or it's not a result of conflict, rather, I should say. Death is not an immediate risk.
Honestly, a lot of times, and this is not to diss feminine fantasy, a lot of times there's not a whole lot of risk anyway. Like think of, again, any Hallmark movie.
Right.
If all the characters stopped plotting, right? By plotting, I mean like stopped doing the plot.
Yeah.
Would anything bad happen?
No.
Usually no.
Yeah.
usually whatever the worst possible consequences of what's happening between like the feminine character and whoever she's trying to resolve her issue with, mm-hmm. Usually the worst possible scenario is that relationship is just never resolved.
Yeah.
And now there's just this like sort of uncomfortableness that the character is just would have to live with if they didn't go out and resolve it.
Yeah. What you're risking in feminine fantasy conflict is you're risking isolation. Really.
Yes, you're risking isolation.
You're risking broken relationships. You're risking being alone.
You're risking unhappiness. Or you're risking more instability because you're going to have to start over.
Yeah. But you're not going to lose life or limb.
No, you're not going to lose life or limb. Nobody's going to die as a result of your inactivity. Mm-hmm. Whereas somebody's definitely going to die in masculine fantasy.
Yeah.
And somebody's going to die to start it. Somebody's going to die along the way, and somebody's going to die at the end. You can't think of any superhero movie. If they don't kill at least one guy before the actual conflict starts, they messed up.
Yeah. And in masculine fantasy, there are relational conflicts.
Yeah.
But there's a key difference, and that is in masculine fantasy, and this is so key. In masculine fantasy, yes, there are relational conflicts. Okay. Character drives the story. Conflict is therefore has to do with character on some degree.
Yes.
So, yes, there are going to be relational conflicts in masculine fantasy. The difference between the relational conflicts in masculine fantasy and feminine fantasy, in feminine fantasy, they are the core conflict.
That's how you're going to progress the plot.
Yeah, that is the entire story, is the relational conflict. In masculine fantasy, the relational conflict is there, but it's only subplot.
In masculine fantasy, it's, look, we're just not in line with this, but we have a job to do. And
the relationships are secondary. Yeah. No, that's good. Whereas in feminine fantasy, you have a fight like that, and suddenly your whole plot's derailed, and you got to start from square one.
Yeah,
it's not. relational conflicts like that are not taken lightly in feminine fantasy because they are the foundation of the storytelling type.
And also, like, if the conflict is not resolved, like, that is hanging over the story. Like, the stories are generally episodic, and so if the story doesn't get resolved now, how is it going to get resolved later?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in the context of resolutions, the ending, because feminine fantasy is so focused on resolution and masculine fantasy is so focused on conflict, right? So remember how we said how feminine fantasy, like when we were talking about sitcoms, how the actual conflict is a very small little bite-sized portion of it. It might even happen off screen. And the whole rest of it is surrounded about, like, how do we resolve this, right? Masculine fantasy is opposite. So the whole thing is conflict.
Conflict.
I have such a big crush on you. Okay, there's so much conflict. And so when the resolution does happen, because you got to resolve the story, you got to end it somewhere, right? When the resolution does happen, it's very quick. It's very quick.
Yeah, it's
the
okay.
climax happens, the highest point of interest, and then that's it.
There's no more movie.
There's no more movie, right?
We have no more conflicts. Go home.
Yeah. And if there is, then it starts to get uncomfortable. Like, have you ever seen, like, a movie where it's like there are, like, one too many epilogues? Like,
yes.
We were done a while ago. As soon as there's no more conflict, there's no more point to a masculine story, right?
Yeah, there's nothing left to conquer. So
there's nothing left to conquer.
Why are you
so the movies end. Yay, we defeated the bad guys.
We all get a medal except for Chewbacca.
The big war at the end is over. You know, feminine fantasy, it's all about resolution. So as soon as we get that sweet, sweet resolution and we get that stability, we're going to bask in it for a while. We're going to see the epilogue. We're going to get married at the end. Like, we're going to, like, see how all the characters are doing. Like, there's going to be kind of...
the tying of the bow.
The tying of the bow. That's a good way of putting it. The ending is going to be a lot more drawn out because you've built up this, you know, this search for stability and this search for this kind of feel-good healing, right? So now you want to sit in it and enjoy it, right? So that's kind of the cherry on top of feminine fantasy is seeing just how that resolution plays out into this,
or at least
this
how,
new status quo,
or at least
right?
how it's going to.
So what about sequels?
Oh yeah, that's a good way to segue right into sequels.
Yeah. Segue right into sequels. No, so here's the interesting thing is all the towards the beginning of the podcast when we talked about the examples of, like, let's list some examples of, you know, masculine fantasy.
Indiana Jones, James Bond, Pirates of the Caribbean.
What do those all have in common?
They're all franchises.
They're all franchises. Yes, and you've talked a lot about Star Wars too.
Yep.
Also a franchise. The feminine fantasy examples, Hallmark movies, early Disney princess movies. What do those have in common?
They're all standalones.
They're
or they have a very unsatisfying sequel.
Yeah. They're one and dones. They're one-trick ponies. Right? So why is this? It's because, remember, character is what drives story.
Right.
Right? So in feminine fantasy, there's so much resolution between the characters that, okay, now all the relational conflict is done and it's resolved. There's no more story left. So it's...
Yeah. My poisonous relationships have been removed from my life, so they're no longer going to affect me negatively. The friendships that were severed have been mended, so now those are stable. Anything that was threatening my home or my family, it's been taken care of.
Yeah. And we've also had this, like, super long epilogue probably to see how, you know, everything's doing great.
What's the trajectory of stability look like?
Right. So there's not really a need for a sequel or, you know, a third movie or a fourth movie or, like, to create a franchise because the whole story's been wrapped up in such a neat, resolved little package. With masculine fantasy, same thing. Everything is character driven,
yes.
right? But with the relational conflict being subplot, you can resolve the big overarching conflict that you've been aiming towards this whole entire story and still have relational conflict unresolved, right? You can still you could still be hating each other, just working for the job.
Hey, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but then tomorrow I'm going to kill you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So because of that, because story is driven by character, the external conflict might be solved, but you still have character conflicts left. You still have that relational conflict left. So that's why, and Marvel's another good example of it's a franchise again, because masculine fantasy, because that relational conflict is so subplot, it leaves room for things to not be resolved by the end. And so
or for resolutions to not be permanent.
Right, exactly. So it opens the door for there to be a second story and a third story and a fourth, and now it's this ongoing franchise and you have an entire universe of, Marvel characters. So masculine and feminine fantasy are both character-driven storylines. Mm-hmm. As any good storyline is. And they both have relational conflict. But because feminine fantasy, it's the core conflict, it's usually one and done. Masculine fantasy, because it's subplot, it leaves room for sequels. And that is why you see...
feminine fantasy franchises.
Yeah.
You'll get, an occasional, Father of the Bride 2, Princess Bride 2...
Yeah, but even then, they're still kind of stories on their own. They're just
they're not connected to the previous story.
Exactly.
And a lot of time, again, it's it's almost as if the story is, most of the time, it's not as it's not as good as the first time, because
no,
and a lot of times the problem with making sequels in feminine fantasy is, you promised me everything was stable. You told me everything was on this trajectory of happily ever after. How can I believe you if it's not happily ever after?
Mm-hmm. So the second one isn't as good.
Unless it's trying to more complete the original conflict. But again, you still fall in sort of that pitfall of, you promised me a happily ever after.
Yeah, exactly. So there is, on that note, on the note of franchises specifically, there is something I wanted to talk about. And this is kind of a touchy subject in the media. And I think approaching it from this perspective of these mega genres of masculine storytelling versus feminine storytelling, it offers a new perspective, I think. And that is kind of the feminization of what would otherwise, be masculine style stories, and kind of taking the same story and recasting it with a female cast.
Or trying to take a masculine story archetype and telling the same general story, but with feminine story plot model.
Yeah, part 1 is going to be masculine storytelling and part 2 is going to be feminine storytelling. And for some reason it doesn't work. And this has happened, the two franchises that I'm thinking of in particular, and I actually did a little research, so you'd be proud of me.
She's showing off.
The two I'm thinking of in particular are the Ocean's movies and Ghostbusters.
Okay.
Both of those are super masculine fantasy.
Yes.
Super masculine. We are the Ghostbusters.
Ghostbusters!
I'm Mr. Ocean. We are the best at what we do, and we're gonna go have this entire masculine storyline. And now suddenly, those movies are they were impactful, they were well done, they became part of the cultural zeitgeist, right?
Right.
And now,
like, Ghostbusters came out in like the 1980s, and it's still, like, you can still find merch. They're still making sequels.
yeah, but one of the sequels, which was
The all-female cast.
the all-female cast, or remake, reboot, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. It was Ghostbusters, but with all girls, right? And the Oceans movies did the same thing. It was Oceans 8?
Oceans 8.
Oceans 8, all-female cast. Why did those movies not do so well? And a lot of people will say, like, oh, you don't like it because, you're being sexist girls. And, you just don't want the women, But I think it's because you're taking what is a masculine storytelling mega genre and you're trying to cram it into what's now, you're expecting to go fight ghosts and you're expecting to go on this like mega heist, and instead we're sitting down and talking about our relational issues. That's a letdown, like, inherently.
That's not to say that like some like intentional action, like some going out and trying to conquer doesn't happen in these films.
Right.
It just means like there's a difference between like is this like what you're bringing everybody to the table for is to go out and to conquer, or are you bringing everybody to the table for like these other reasons?
Yeah.
And these other reasons can be good. Like there's lots of great examples of feminine fantasy.
Yeah.
It's just why are you trying to make a masculine fantasy a feminine fantasy if everybody's showing up for the masculine fantasy?
Right. Is the Saw franchise,
Yeah.
Saw number 7, 10, 14.
1100.
However many Saw movies there are, like one too many, right? If they came out with another Saw movie and everyone went to the theaters like expecting to see a Saw movie and it was a rom-com, like how disorienting that would be, right? And maybe the rom-com in and of itself would be a great movie, but because you're going into it with Saw,
the expectation of this is the franchise,
then it's gonna bomb, And so yes, there can be action in feminine fantasy, just like how there can be relational conflict in masculine fantasy, but it's a difference of what is the core conflict and what's just subplot stuff.
And you can't take a masculine fantasy of this great big genre or this great big model type and then convert it to the completely opposite model type.
And you can't do it. Yeah, you can do it because obviously they did, but you can't do it and expect it to have the same impact on the culture as the original. So let's talk about Ghostbusters first. Ghostbusters.
She has homework.
I did some research. So the Ghostbusters movie came out in 2016, so that's relatively recent. So, and here's what it says. According to Wikipedia, because according to Michael Scott, Wikipedia
is the greatest thing ever.
Yes, of course.
It's the greatest thing ever because anyone can write on any topic. And so you know that you're only getting the very best.
Yes. So according to Wikipedia, I did, see it elsewhere. This was just the most concise rendition of the quote. So, Ghostbusters 2016, the one with the all-female cast, it lost $70 million at the box office.
That is not your goal for selling a story.
It bombed in theaters. Columbia abandoned plans for a sequel, opting instead to continue the original film canon with Ghostbusters Afterlife, which came out in 2021.
Which we both enjoyed.
That was a fun movie. So they recognized, okay, all-female cast, it didn't do so well. Let's backtrack and go back to our original plan.
Let's go back to the model that worked and try and see how we can make it work again.
Right. The second one I did research on was the Ocean's 8. So Rotten Tomatoes, according to Rotten Tomatoes, the film had an approval rating of 6 out of 10. Which...
yeah, that's not that good.
No, it's not that good.
Some would say that's barely above average.
Yeah.
Mathematically.
The website's critical consensus reads, and I quote, Ocean's 8 isn't quite as smooth as its predecessors. Like, surprise, surprise. Another quote, this one by a
Critic?
A critic. He says, the cast is fantastic and the team is great. And that's true. They had an all-star cast.
Yeah.
Right? The cast is fantastic and the team is great, he said, which is why the movie actually did do quite well. However, at the end of the day, we want a good story and a smart heist, and it just wasn't there. That's exactly what he's saying. We were expecting masculine fantasy,
But we didn't get it.
but we didn't get it.
I watched Ocean's 8 in theaters. And not to belittle the all-star cast, because I looked at the cast and I was like, these are some impressive names. These are some like really good names in the film industry and in acting. And I looked at it and I was invited to go with a buddy of mine, and he was like, "Hey, how about Ocean's 8?" And I told him, "Look, I'm going to be honest. I can feel it in my bones. This is not going to be a good movie. Like, I will watch it if this is what you want to go see, but this is not going to be a good movie." He felt so bad, he gave me my money for the tickets back.
Oh my gosh. Because it's just not what you're expecting.
It is a beat-for-beat feminine fantasy. Mm-hmm. But, again, you're trying to take a genre and force it to be another genre. Think of it, again, as trying to take a Saw movie and make it a rom-com. Yeah. On the visceral, emotional level, that's what's happening. If you were to do this exact same thing with feminine fantasy into masculine fantasy, it wouldn't work the other way around either.
Yeah. It's just, you don't see that as commonly because, first of all, we don't have the push for, turning women into men the way we do, feminizing more masculine things, like with the whole feminist push.
With girl power, inherently comes the push for making...
Right. And also, so there's that, but also feminine fantasy so rarely leaves room for sequels, so you don't get remakes and reboots in feminine fantasy. And franchises very easily. And there's one more quote I want to read. We find it. Okay, senior media analyst said, if you're going to repaint the Mona Lisa, you better do it in a way that lives up to the legacy, or at least the perception people have of the original. Like,
yeah, that sums it up so well.
That sums it up so well. And it's not because there are women in the cast.
No.
That's kind of like what the debate and the pushback of like, you can't say these movies were bad because you just don't want to see women in these movies. No, it's not about the women being in the movies. It's about the fact that in order to facilitate women being in these movies, you changed the overall structure of the movie. And on the topic of genres, like, okay, masculine fantasy storytelling, feminine fantasy storytelling. They're mega genres, right? That's what we've defined them as.
Mega genres.
And so smaller genres, what we would normally think of as genres, do tend to fall in one category or another. Mm-hmm. For example, horror, almost exclusively masculine.
Well, it has to be almost exclusively masculine because, again, it's all about stable becomes unstable and has to be resolved through conflict.
Right.
And that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for just resolving right now.
Yeah, a horror movie that's focused on resolution and that doesn't have any risk of life or limb, it's
not a horror movie.
Yeah, that's gonna suck as a horror movie. Whereas, like, rom-coms tend to be more feminine fantasy because
it's all about misunderstanding.
Yeah.
It's all about, like...
You don't want to watch a rom-com that, there's a risk of great tragedy and it's all just about fighting the whole time.
The genre is dominated by feminine fantasy. Because that is the model that works so well with it. And rom-coms, it kind of fits in the same thing with kind of like the sitcom. Everybody is great at the end. Like, life is now stable.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm not saying a story is bad if it's super masculine fantasy. A story is not bad if it's super feminine fantasy. There are super successful stories that had a huge impact on our culture that are like one extreme or the other. But there are some really good, well done stories that kind of meet in the middle and like have aspects of both. They might lean towards one or the other, like but they're big, not like
big plot. It's
one,
and then like subplot or even the facilitation of the big plot. Is the other. And it really does a good job of like playing off of each other. And makes it so that both aspects of the story are now interesting. Having a masculine plot with a feminine subplot, or vice versa, makes it so that both the plot and the subplot are equally important and are equally important in resolving each other.
One of ones you've talked about before is How to Train Your Dragon.
I love How to Train Your Dragon.
We all love How to Train Your Dragon. But it's, even though, like, there's fighting and there's Vikings and there's adventure, it's totally a feminine fantasy.
It is absolutely a feminine fantasy.
Hiccup is, subpar. He's, underappreciated, misunderstood. Everything is great, but there's this one thing. We have dragons.
Yeah. Well, actually, everything sucks.
Everything does suck.
Everything sucks in that, like, it's boring and nothing interesting happens. Except for this one interesting thing that happens and it sucks.
He presents it as like, this is just life.
But there is a slight problem.
There's a slight problem, right? And so he goes out to resolves this relationship with the dragon. He, is more understood by
his peers.
And
all of this builds up to the biggest conflict of the story, which is his dad. It's not the great big dragon that they fight at the end of the movie, although the great big dragon fight is so much fun to watch. It's all about his relationship with his dad.
Yeah, that's what the story's all about. It's about resolving that relationship. But, so even though it's a feminine fantasy, there's still that masculine fantasy subplot, which is going to fight the big dragon.
Like learning how to fly with Toothless. Becoming more, like, capable with handling the dragons. Hiccup transforms in order to get to the point where he can resolve and be appreciated.
There's that evolution and transformation in order to accept this condition we're in of having dragons, right? So it's like a really nice blend of primarily feminine and then with the subplot of masculine to as like a vehicle to like progress the feminine storyline.
And then another example in the opposite direction of masculine fantasy with a feminine subplot. We saw it this year. Top Gun Maverick.
Yeah. There's so much relationship, like, as an undertone throughout that story.
Yeah, like obviously the big conflict is the fact that there's an enemy superpower somewhere, like
in the snow,
kind of amorphous bad guy, or Korea or China. Who does it say? The amorphous bad guy has nuclear bombs, and that's an existential crisis that needs to be conquered. And Maverick is the best at doing this.
Yes. But he has this relationship that he's got to take care of. And that relationship, that feminine subplot, is the vehicle that drives the main masculine plot to its ultimate success.
And also is the only way that he actually ultimately is capable of succeeding, because he needs Rooster in order to fulfill the quest, in order to conclude what's going on.
So some really quick examples. We're not going to go into them too deeply, but just rattling off like some pretty popular movies. And I'm going to masculine or feminine, okay? Bullet Train just came out. We saw it in theaters.
That is a masculine fantasy to the nth degree. Every character.
So hard.
Every character is masculine fantasy.
I'm the best.
I am the best at what I do, except for the one character who's like, I'm not supposed to be here.
But he's still the best at what he does. Even though he doesn't see himself that way, like, he still is.
He's still going out and doing.
Yes. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
Ooh, that's a little trickier because there is so much action.
There is so much action.
But it's feminine fantasy.
It's feminine
because
fantasy.
Because the central conflict is her relationship with her husband and her relationship with her daughter.
Yeah.
And everything is resolved. And everything starts out as, my life is okay, but also, like, there is this thing that I guess technically kind of sucks.
Yeah. And I really don't have as much stability as
I really don't have as much stability as I want people to believe.
Yeah.
Frozen. That's
Frozen?
It's a really popular movie.
Feminine fantasy. Even though, it's definitely feminine fantasy. I was going to say even though Elsa's, like, the queen, but really it's not as much about Elsa as it is about Anna, and she's like the dorky little princess who
she is the dorky
just wants
princess.
The resolution with her sister, right? So
the
feminine fantasy.
The entire plot is about her resolving her relationship with her sister.
Right. Yeah. Okay, here's a curveball.
Okay.
Hitch.
Ooh, Hitch. Because it is a rom-com.
It is a rom-com.
Which usually lands in the feminine fantasy bracket. But I think I'm still going to lean a little bit towards masculine fantasy on this one. Mm-hmm. Because Hitch, his whole job is to go out and woo the girl. He's going out and trying to conquer her not being...
Exactly.
Like, in a relationship with him. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if the relationship with her is the quest that he's on. Yeah,
exactly. He's not seeking resolution. He's seeking to conquer the singleness. And even the love interest of Hitch, like, she's not some plain Jane. She's, like, top of her class, right? Yeah. She fits a masculine fantasy character profile.
Hitch is the best at what he does. Mm-hmm. She's the best at what she does. Mm-hmm. She's the only one that's able to figure out who Hitch is.
Yeah.
The characters are highly competent. And that's something you see in a lot of masculine fantasy, is characters are highly competent. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hit me with one.
Up.
I'm actually going to say Up is a really beautiful blend of the two.
Okay, I can see that.
Okay, so you have the old man, and overarching plot...
He's on a quest.
It's masculine fantasy. He's going to go take his house to the top of the waterfall, and he's going to take down this crazy... super, super old guy who, why is he still alive?
Why is he still alive, and why isn't he made millions of dollars on a dog translation device? Like, I don't care.
Wrong with this
I don't care if you found this extinct species of bird or not. Like, you invented
I want to talk to my dog, okay?
You invented talking dogs.
So, yeah, masculine fantasy, right? Maybe, he's not maybe the best at what he does, but...
He's the only one who's done it.
He's the only one who's done it. So, yeah, I guess he is the best at what he does. But you have this subplot, this super feminine fantasy subplot about building that relationship with the child that he never had.
Yeah.
And this kid getting the relationship with the father that he wants so much.
And Doug. Doug finally has... like that relationship with a good master that cares about him. And Doug even gets the relationship with the other dogs.
Yeah. And so like this...
everyone's happy except for like, the bad guy who falls off.
One by one, piece by piece resolution of this subplot is what drives the overarching, masculine storyline to be able to complete.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how often, like, if you can find a story that is on one side and is on the other, it's usually a story that people just find is inherently enjoyable. At least if both sides are done well. Like, you can still have the ingredients of a lot of masculine fantasy with a little bit of feminine fantasy, or the reverse, and still produce hot garbage because it's hot garbage. But if you can do that main plot, subplot relationship where it meets in the middle, really chef's kiss.
Chef's kiss, yes.
All right, I have to ask this one because it's on my mind because we just saw it like a couple weeks ago. Encanto.
Feminine fantasy. So let's look at it, right? So the main girl, this is going to be fast because we have an actual movie that we are going to pick
break
apart
down an entire
piece
movie.
by piece, but we're not there yet. Main girl, right? Everything, she presents it as stable, but there's this one thing. She's missing her abilities, right? And so there's this one thing, and she's seeking stability. And literally the whole movie, there's no real, like, overarching thing to conquer and defeat and, like, chase after. She's literally, like, going to each individual family member and being
having
like,
a conversation.
Hey, what's up? And then they sing, their backstory song, and then there's, like, that resolution. And so she moves on to the next family member, and they sing about their backstory. And now there's a resolution. Then she moves on. It's very episodic. And it's very, like, she almost doesn't really have to do anything to earn that resolution other than just, like, relate to them.
Other than, just, like, having the relationship and being honest.
Like, that's
it.
That's it.
And,
like, she doesn't have to...
And also, like, this is going to sound really mean. At no point in time is the story necessary to continue. Like, there are no consequences, even if like the family all loses their powers, even if they lose their house. Like, the worst possible scenario is, like, they're just a dysfunctional family that don't talk. I'm sorry. That happens.
Or that they're now homeless and have to find a new house. But, like,
which also happens.
Literally the biggest risk is instability.
And rejection.
Yeah. So it's super hardcore feminine fantasy. So that is enough.
That is enough. You've heard us ramble long enough.
You've heard us ramble. So that's it. That we're going to stop ourselves there because we could analyze this to no end. So that's it for you guys on YouTube. If you are part of our Patreon,
the show is not over. We have more in honor of it being October. Look at the pumpkins. We have pumpkins. In honor of it being October, we are going to continue this, and we are going to analyze piece by piece, almost scene by scene. We're going to apply this analysis of masculine versus feminine fantasy to a very popular movie that has had a huge impact on the cultural zeitgeist, and that is Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. You might be surprised by what we have to say.
Yeah. You will be. So, if you want to see the full video, if you want to see us, like, really pick it apart scene by scene and really kind of explain, like, why it was so impactful to culture, I think. And if you want to find out what our next video's topic will be, click the link below. Be sure to join my Patreon. Like, subscribe, share it to other people. Be sure to comment. We want to hear what stories do you see these mega genres in. Some of our favorite comments might pop up in a next video, so be sure to say some. Let us know what you guys think.